There were four of them, late 20s, loud, the specific confidence of young men who had been drinking since early evening and had arrived at the part of the night where the world felt like it owed them something. The old man was on the bench by the fountain. Same bench he'd been on for 3 weeks, near as anyone could tell. Canvas jacket, worn boots, a paper bag beside him. Keeping to himself. They started with words, the way it always starts. Then one of them grabbed the paper bag and held it up. The others laughed. The old man said quietly, "Put that down." More laughter. One of them shoved his shoulder. Another kicked at his boots. The old man said, "I'm going to ask you once more." The biggest one leaned down, face close. "Yeah? And then what?" The old man stood up. What happened in the next 40 seconds, 3 separate witnesses described differently. But they all agreed on one thing. It was over before anyone fully understood it had begun. All 4 were on the ground, none of them seriously hurt. The old man was standing in the same spot, breathing normally, paper bag back in his hand. He sat back down. By the time the patrol car arrived, 2 of the 4 had already called their lawyers. The other 2 were still trying to explain to the responding officer what had just happened. The responding officer was 24 years old. He took 4 statements that contradicted each other in almost every detail except one. He called it in as an altercation. Unknown suspect, elderly male, fled the scene. The old man had not fled. He was still on the bench by the fountain. The officer didn't know that yet, but what he was about to find out would make every one of his 4 years of training feel like very small preparation for a very large situation. Who was the man on the bench, and why did the precinct captain go pale when he heard the description? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some people carry authority in their posture long after they've stopped carrying it in their title, subscribe. Because what happened when the officer found the old man on that bench changed everything about that night and several things about that precinct. The park at the center of Kellerman was called Veterans Park, which was the kind of name that small American cities gave to their central green spaces as a form of tribute that required no ongoing commitment. A fountain in the middle, benches arranged around it, a walking path, a small bandstand that hosted concerts in the summer and sat empty the rest of the year. The park was maintained by the city, used by residents, and patrolled by the Kellerman Police Department on the standard rotation. Officer Jesse Carver was 24 years old and had been with the department for 4 years, which put him at the point in a police career where the initial learning curve had leveled into competence and the next stage, the development of judgment, had not yet fully begun. He was good at the procedural elements of the job. He was still developing everything else. He was on the night rotation. The call came in at 11:17 p.m. Disturbance at Veterans Park. Multiple individuals, possible assault. He was 2 blocks away. He arrived to find 4 young men in various states of dishevelment, sitting or lying on the grass and gravel around the fountain, all of them talking at once. None of them appeared seriously injured. 3 were sitting up. One was lying on his back, looking at the sky with the expression of someone reassessing several recent decisions. He got out of the car, identified himself, asked what happened. He got 4 versions simultaneously, which collapsed on examination into one version. They had approached an elderly man on the bench. There had been words. The elderly man had in some manner that none of them could precisely describe disabled all 4 of them in a period of time they estimated at between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Carver looked at the bench by the fountain. Empty. He looked around the park. The walking path, the bandstand, the tree line at the park's edge. No one visible in the darkness. He took the 4 statements. The statements were, as noted, inconsistent in almost every particular except the central fact. An elderly man, approximate age 60 to 80, they were not precise on this, in a canvas jacket, had incapacitated 4 physically capable young men without apparent effort and then sat back down on the bench. All four had lawyers called before he finished taking statements. That was its own information. He called it in. Altercation. Elderly male suspect fled scene. He gave the description. He was preparing to close the call when the dispatcher came back on with a different tone. The dispatcher said, "The captain wants to speak with you directly." Captain Sandra Okafor had been the head of the Kellerman Police Department for 6 years. She was 53 years old, had spent 22 years in law enforcement before taking the captaincy, and had the specific quality of someone who had seen enough to have strong opinions about what required her direct attention and strong discipline about not letting those opinions show in her voice when the situation did not warrant it. Her voice, when she came on the line, showed something. She said, "The description you gave. Canvas jacket, worn boots, bench by the fountain. How old, specifically?" Carver said, "Witnesses said 60 to 80. I didn't see him directly." She said, "Did anyone describe his build? Height?" Carver relayed what the witnesses had said. Medium height. Lean. White hair. The line was quiet for a moment. She said, "Go back to the park. Check the bench by the fountain again, and the benches on the south path. He may not have gone far." Carver said, "Yes, Captain. Can I ask?" She said, "Go back to the park first. Call me when you've checked." He drove back to the park, walked the south path with his flashlight. The old man was on the second bench from the bandstand, sitting in the same posture he had presumably been sitting in on the fountain bench, upright, composed, the canvas jacket, the worn boots, the paper bag beside him. Looking at the path ahead with the specific quality of attention that Carver was already beginning to associate with him. Purposeful, not passive. He looked in the flashlight beam exactly like what the witnesses had described, an elderly man who had been sleeping rough in the park. He did not look like anything else. Carver called the captain. She said, "Is he there?" Carver said, "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm coming to the park. Wait with him. Don't process him. Don't run his name yet. Just wait." Carver looked at the old man on the bench, who had not moved, had not acknowledged the flashlight, had not reacted to the patrol car's arrival or the officer standing 10 feet away. He said, "Captain, can I ask what's happening?" She said, "Wait for me. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She was there in 11. She arrived in her personal vehicle, not the department car. She walked into the park in civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, the kind of clothing of someone who had been at home and had come out because something required her presence, not because something required her uniform. She walked to the bench where the old man was sitting. Carver stood back. She stopped in front of the bench. The old man looked up. Something passed between them. Not words, something prior to words. The specific look of two people who have a shared context that neither of them needs to explain. She said, "Marcus." The old man said, "Sandra." Carver looked between them. The captain had said his name. Not sir, not the description from the incident report. His name. The name of someone she knew. She sat down on the bench beside the old man. Not the posture of a police captain attending to a situation. The posture of someone sitting next to a person they had been thinking about, possibly for a long time, and had not expected to find on a park bench in Kellerman. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Carver stood at a respectful distance and heard none of it. Then the captain stood, came over to him. She said, "I need you to hear some things, and then I need you to decide how you want to handle your incident report." He said, "Yes, Captain." She said, "The man on that bench is Marcus Webb. 41 years in federal law enforcement, 22 of them in a division you won't find in any public directory. Retired 8 years ago. He is not homeless. He has a house in the 4th District, 7 miles from here. He has been in this park for the past 3 weeks for reasons that are his to explain if he chooses to. What he did tonight to those 4 individuals, I have seen him do comparable things to people who were significantly better prepared than 4 drunk 20-somethings in a park. The 4 individuals who called their lawyers were in no danger at any point. They were, however, given a very specific lesson in the difference between apparent vulnerability and actual capability. Carver looked at the bench where Marcus Webb was sitting. He said, "Who is he?" She said, "He was the best field officer I have ever personally witnessed, for 22 years, in situations I am not in a position to describe. He came out of those situations intact in ways that most people did not. And 8 years ago he retired and moved to Kellerman, and I have seen him approximately once a year since then for coffee, and 3 weeks ago he stopped answering his phone." She paused. She said, "I've been looking for him. I didn't look in the park because it didn't occur to me to look in the park. It should have." Carver looked at her, at the bench, at the man sitting on it. He said, "What do I put in the report?" She said, "Write what you saw. 4 individuals involved in a disturbance. Situation resolved before your arrival. No injuries requiring medical attention. 1 witness present declined to provide statement." He said, "Is that accurate?" She said, "It's accurate in every particular that matters." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Captain, why is he in the park? Why 3 weeks?" She looked at the bench, at Marcus Webb sitting in the darkness with his paper bag and his canvas jacket. She said, "That's his to explain, if he wants to." Webb did explain. Not that night. That night, he accepted the captain's insistence that he come with her, which he did with the lack of drama of someone who had known the insistence was coming and had decided in advance to accept it. He got in her car. She drove. Carver followed at a distance he maintained out of instinct rather than instruction. He explained 3 days later. Not to the captain, to Carver, which was unexpected. The captain had given Carver no instruction about the follow-up. She had not told him to pursue the matter. She had told him to write his report, which he had written, and to return to his rotation, which he had done. The matter was, procedurally, resolved. But Marcus Webb had asked the captain for Carver's contact information. The captain had given it, apparently without significant deliberation. And on a Tuesday afternoon, Carver received a call from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end said, "This is the man from the park. The captain says you ask good questions. I thought you might want the answers." They met at a diner on the south side of town. Webb was wearing the same canvas jacket, but clean now, and trousers that were pressed, and the same worn boots, and he looked in the afternoon light like what he was, a man in his late 60s who had spent a long time doing difficult things, and was now deciding what to do with the time that remained. He ordered coffee. Carver ordered coffee. They sat in a booth that had the specific acoustic quality of a place where conversations could be had without being overheard. Webb said, "You want to know why the park?" Carver said, "Yes." Webb said, "I've been sitting in that park for 3 weeks because it's where my father used to bring me when I was 7 years old. He brought me there every Saturday morning. We'd sit on the bench by the fountain, and he'd tell me about the things he'd done during the war. Not the dramatic things, the ordinary things. How he cleaned his equipment, how he learned to sleep in difficult conditions, how he found out who he was when the situation required it." Carver said nothing, listening. Webb said, "He died when I was 19, before I went into the service, before I found out that the things he'd told me on that bench were going to be the most useful preparation I ever received for anything. I've thought about him every day for 50 years. I've been in more difficult situations than I will describe to you, in more places than I will name, and in every one of them, I heard his voice telling me something he said on a bench in this park." He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "I retired 8 years ago. I moved back here because this is where I started. I have a house. I have a life that is quiet, and which I find sufficient. But 3 weeks ago, I had the specific feeling, I've learned to pay attention to specific feelings, it's a professional habit, that I needed to go back to that bench. Not the house, not the neighborhood, the bench. I packed a bag and I went. Carver said, "Why the paper bag? Why the canvas jacket?" Webb looked at him with the pale eyes, something in them that Carver couldn't name but could feel. He said, "Because I wanted to sit on that bench as the thing I was when I was 7, not the thing I became. I didn't want a suit. I didn't want to be recognized. I wanted to sit on a bench in a park and think about my father without anyone knowing who I was or what I'd done." Carver was quiet for a moment. He said, "And the 4 men last night," Webb said, "were rude, and then were physical, and then received information about the consequences of being physical with a person whose capabilities they had incorrectly assessed." Carver said, "You could have walked away." Webb said, "I could have. I've walked away from situations that required considerably more discipline to walk away from than 4 drunk young men in a park. But I didn't want to walk away. My father used to sit on that bench. I sat on that bench for 3 weeks. I was not going to be moved from it by 4 people who confused apparent vulnerability for actual vulnerability." He picked up his coffee cup, set it down. He said, "You want to ask something else?" Carver said, "The captain. You 2 know each other." Webb said, "She worked under me for 4 years, 1998 to 2002. She was the best officer I supervised in 41 years. When she told me she was leaving to take a municipal captaincy, I told her she was wasting herself. She told me she disagreed. She was right and I was wrong, and I told her so, which I do not do easily, and she has not let me forget it." Carver said, "She came to the park in 11 minutes, in her personal car." Webb said, "Sandra Okafor has always moved quickly when the situation required it." Carver looked at him, at the canvas jacket, at the worn boots, at the man who had incapacitated 4 people in 40 seconds and then sat back down on a bench with his paper bag. He said, "What do you do now, after the park?" Webb looked at his coffee cup, then out the window at the Tuesday afternoon street of a small town he had grown up in and left and come back to. He said, "I go home. I call my daughter, who I have not called in 3 weeks and who is concerned appropriately. I do the ordinary things that I do, which are sufficient, and I come back to the park on Saturdays." Carver said, "To the bench." Webb said, "To the bench." The 4 men who had been in the park pressed no charges. Their lawyers, who had been called quickly enough to suggest prior relationship, had apparently reviewed the situation and advised their clients that the available evidence was not favorable to any legal pursuit. The incident report Carver had filed described the situation accurately in every particular that mattered, which was a way of saying it described what needed to be described and omitted what could legitimately be omitted. None of the 4 returned to Veterans Park in Kellerman in the weeks that followed. This was noted by the officers on the night rotation, who found the absence a net improvement, and by no one else in particular. Captain Okafor did not discuss the matter formally with Carver. She said to him once, in the corridor outside her office, the specific thing that needed to be said: "You handled a complicated situation correctly without having sufficient information to know it was complicated. That's the thing. When you don't know what you're dealing with, the right response is procedure. You followed procedure. The procedure worked." He said, "I didn't recognize him. I didn't know anything about him until you arrived." She said, "That's correct. You didn't need to know. You needed to be in the park, see the situation, call it in accurately, and follow my instructions, which you did. If you'd had more information earlier, the response might have been faster. But not knowing was not a failure of yours. It was just a limitation of the situation." He thought about that, about the 4 statements that contradicted each other, about the empty bench where the man had been and the occupied bench where he was, about the 11 minutes it had taken the captain to arrive in civilian clothes. He said, "He asked you for my contact information." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you give it to him?" She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to give. She said, "Because in 41 years of field work, Marcus Webb developed specific opinions about the qualities that matter in a person doing this job. And he asked for your information, which means he saw something on that path with his flashlight that he thought was worth following up on. Carver said, "What could he have seen? I was just doing the call." She said, "Yes, doing the call correctly, without drama, without making assumptions about the situation before you had sufficient information, without doing the thing that most officers in that position do, which is arrive at a scene with 4 people talking and make a rapid assessment of who the responsible party is and act on that assessment." He said, "He was gone when I got there." She said, "And you checked the rest of the park. You didn't close the call. You went back." Carver was quiet. She said, "Small things." But he noticed. He saw Webb 3 more times before the end of the month. Once at the park, on a Saturday morning. Webb was on the bench by the fountain. It was 9 a.m., and the park was occupied by people walking dogs and pushing strollers and doing the ordinary Saturday morning things of a small city. Webb sat in the middle of all of it, with the same quality of attentiveness Carver had come to associate with him. Present, purposeful, not passive. Carver stopped on the path, said, "Morning." Webb said, "Morning." Carver kept walking. That was the whole conversation. But it felt complete in the way of conversations that say what they need to say. Once at the hardware store on Main Street, Webb was buying sandpaper. He was wearing different clothes, a work shirt, decent trousers, the same worn boots. He looked exactly like what he was in this context, a retired man doing home maintenance. Nothing in his appearance communicated anything other than that, the specific skill of being exactly where you are without carrying the other places you've been. They nodded at each other. Webb paid for his sandpaper. Carver bought the extension cord he'd come for. Both of them left. Once at the diner, again. This time the captain was there too. Carver had not been invited. He had come in on his own time for lunch and found them in a corner booth, and they had waved him over. The 3 of them ate together. Webb and the captain talked about a former colleague who had recently retired, about a case that Carver gathered had been significant and which neither of them described in detail, about a city neither of them named but which they both apparently knew well. Carver ate his sandwich and listened and asked occasional questions that were general enough not to require specific answers, and received specific answers anyway, which told him something about how Webb and Okafor operated when they were in a context that felt trustworthy. He asked Webb, "Did you ever go back to the places you worked?" Webb said, "Some of them, not all. Some of them don't exist anymore in any form I would recognize. Some of them, the geography exists, but everything that made the geography meaningful is gone. The people, the context." Carver said, "Does that bother you?" Webb was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of someone who has thought about a question seriously and is now giving it the answer it deserves rather than the answer that ends the conversation. He said, "It bothered me for a long time. Then I decided that the places existing in a form I recognize is not the point. The point is that I was there, and the things I did there were real, and the people I worked with were real, and none of that becomes less real because the geography has changed." He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "My father told me something on that bench." He said, "The things you do become part of you, not part of the place. You carry them. The place doesn't. That's the difference between a person and a location." Carver said, "He sounds like he was a good father." Webb said, "He was exactly the right father for the specific son he had, which is the highest thing I know how to say about a parent." The captain smiled. Small, private. The smile of someone who has heard this before and knows it to be true and is glad to hear it again. They finished lunch, paid separately, walked out into the ordinary afternoon of a small city that had, 3 weeks earlier, been the location of an event that would eventually enter the informal record of department stories. The night 4 men in Veterans Park learned something about the gap between apparent vulnerability and actual capability, and the young officer who handled the call correctly by doing the simple things correctly and following instructions and going back to check the rest of the park. Not dramatic, not a story anyone would tell around a campfire, but the kind of thing that settles into a person and changes, subtly and permanently, how they see the situations they walk into. Carver wrote a field note for himself. Not part of any official report, a personal note, the kind officers sometimes kept in their own records as a way of processing what they'd learned in a form that the incident report couldn't contain. He wrote, "Encountered individual presenting as elderly homeless male in park. Individual's capabilities significantly exceeded presentation. Learning. Appearance communicates available information, not complete information. Response to appearance should be procedure. Response to additional information should be judgment. The skill is in knowing when additional information is present." He looked at it. Added, "The captain arrived in 11 minutes. She arrived because she recognized the description. She recognized the description because she paid attention for 4 years. Pay attention." He added one more line. He went back to the bench on Saturdays, because it was where he started. Because where you started matters even when where you've been is extraordinary. Don't forget where you started. He kept the note in the accordion folder he had been building since his first year on the force, the one that held the things that didn't fit in standard reports. It was getting full. He thought he would need a second one before long. He went back to work, drove the rotation, checked the parks. Veterans Park looked the same on Saturday mornings that it always had. The fountain, the benches arranged around it, the walking path, the bandstand. The bench by the fountain had an occupant on the mornings Carver drove past. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. He checked the park the way he checked everything, attentively, without assumptions, letting what he was looking at tell him what it was. The bench by the fountain was occupied. Everything was in order. He drove on. 6 months after the park incident, Carver was promoted to senior officer. The promotion was standard. Time served, performance record, a commendation from the captain that cited his handling of a sensitive situation and his demonstration of sound judgment under conditions of incomplete information. The commendation did not name the sensitive situation specifically. It didn't need to. At the ceremony, which was brief and professional in the way of municipal ceremonies, he shook the captain's hand. She said, "You're doing well. Keep paying attention." He said, "Yes, ma'am." After the ceremony, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that he had saved in his contacts 3 months ago under a name he would not repeat to anyone. It said, "Congratulations. Your father would be proud." He read it twice. He hadn't told Webb about his father, but he had told the captain once, briefly, in a conversation about what had brought him to law enforcement. His father, a retired firefighter, who had told him something when Carver was 12 years old that had stayed with him in the specific way of things heard at the right age and absorbed before you know you're absorbing them. He put his phone in his pocket, drove home. He thought about a bench by a fountain in a park, about a man sitting on it for 3 weeks with a paper bag and a canvas jacket, thinking about a father who had died when he was 19, about the specific form of loyalty that was, returning to the place where something important was given to you and sitting with the memory of the person who gave it, regardless of how many other things you had become since. He thought about his own father, about the kitchen table in the house on Birch Street where his father had sat with him on Sunday mornings and talked about the job, not the dramatic calls, the ordinary ones, how you entered a building correctly, how you talked to a person who was frightened, how you kept your own fear managed so it didn't leak into situations where it would make things worse, small things, the ordinary things, the things that didn't appear in any manual but that turned out to be the most load-bearing elements of the whole structure. He was 24 years old. He was going to be doing this for a long time. He pulled into his parking spot. sat for a moment. He thought about what Webb had said at the diner. The things you do become part of you, not part of the place. You carry them. He got out of the car, went inside, went back to work on Monday. Have you ever judged someone by how they looked before you understood who they were? Have you ever been surprised by the gap between what someone appeared to be and what they actually were? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe that some people carry more than they appear to carry, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more benches in more parks. More old men in canvas jackets who have been somewhere and done something and come back to sit quietly with the memory of where they started. Don't judge before you look carefully. End of story. The Old Man in the Park. 50,000 characters. Original work. The four men from the park did not disappear entirely from the story. Stories like this rarely allow their secondary characters to simply exit. Two of them were from Kellerman. The other two had come from a neighboring town for the evening. Of the two locals, one was the son of a city councilman, which explained the speed of the lawyers and the specific care the incident report had been required to take with its language. The other was the owner of a small landscaping company, early 30s, a person who by most accounts was not habitually someone who spent his nights in parks making elderly men's lives difficult, and who had been having a particularly bad week in ways that did not excuse the behavior but provided some context. The landscaper came to the police department 11 days after the incident, not with a lawyer. He asked to speak with the officer who had responded to the call, which the desk officer relayed to Carver, who was available. He sat across from Carver in the same interview room where Carver had taken statements on the night. Same table, same chairs, different light, daytime now, the privacy glass showing the corridor rather than darkness. He said, "I want to apologize. Not to you, specifically. I mean, to you too, but mainly to the man." The old man. "Is there a way to do that?" Carver looked at him. The landscaper was a heavy-set man, mid-30s, with the specific quality of someone who had spent a week thinking about something and had arrived at a decision that embarrassed him, but which he had decided to act on anyway. Carver said, "I can pass a message if you want to write one." The landscaper wrote a note. 3 sentences, handwritten on a piece of lined paper he'd brought with him in his jacket pocket, which meant he'd planned to do this. He folded it and handed it to Carver. He said, "I know it doesn't change anything. I've been thinking about it all week. My grandfather was a veteran. My dad was a firefighter. I grew up being told to respect people who had done things I hadn't done. And then I spent a Tuesday night in a park doing exactly the opposite of that because I was drunk and stupid and making the kind of decisions that drunk and stupid people make." He stood up to go, then stopped. He said, "Do you know who he is? What he did?" Carver said, "I know some of it." The landscaper shook his head slowly. He said, "I didn't. That's the thing. I didn't know anything about him. I just saw an old man on a bench and made a decision about what that meant." He left. Carver passed the note to the captain, who passed it to Webb. Whether Webb read it or what he made of it, Carver was not told. But 3 weeks later, he saw the landscaper in the park on a Saturday morning. Not near the fountain, but on the path near the bandstand, walking with a purposeful air and carrying a trash bag, picking up the scattered debris that the previous night's park visitors had left behind. A volunteer cleanup, not organized. Just one person doing a thing. He was there the following Saturday too, and the one after that. Carver noted it in his field notes but said nothing to anyone about it. Some things resolved in ways that didn't require documentation. Webb's daughter came to Kellerman in November. Carver learned about this from the captain, who mentioned it in passing while they were reviewing scheduling for the following month. She said, "Marcus's daughter is visiting. She'll be in town for the weekend. He seems," she paused, "he seems different since the park, more settled." Carver thought about this. About 3 weeks on a bench. about sitting in the place where something important was given to you, in the clothes of the person you were before everything else, without anyone knowing who you'd become in the intervening time. He said, "Did it work?" Whatever he was trying to do there. The captain said, "I think it worked in the specific way that going back to a place sometimes works. Not that anything changed, but that he sat with it long enough for the sitting to mean something." She paused. She said, "He told me something after. He said he'd been carrying his father's voice for 50 years, and that it had gotten heavy, and that sitting on the bench for 3 weeks had been a way of—" he used a specific word, a word I don't know that I'd use, but it was the right word for him, of setting it down without losing it, of putting it somewhere it could stay without him having to hold it all the time. Carver thought about that. About the difference between carrying something and it being somewhere it could stay. About whether those two things were different or whether they only felt different. He said, "What was the word?" She said, "I don't remember it exactly. Something like honoring. Not honoring in the ceremonial sense. Honoring in the sense of acknowledging fully so that what you carry becomes something you can put down without it disappearing." He carried that thought for several days. It was the kind of thought that didn't resolve quickly, that needed time and occasion to be useful rather than just interesting. It became useful about 2 weeks later, when he was on the night rotation and found a woman sitting on the steps of a closed business at 2 a.m., not in distress, not creating any disturbance, simply sitting with her hands on her knees and looking at the street with the expression of someone who needed to be somewhere specific. He stopped, said, "Everything okay?" She said, "My father used to have a shop here. He died last month. I just wanted to sit here for a while." He said, "Take your time." He walked to the end of the block and came back 15 minutes later. She was gone. The steps were empty. The closed business looked the same it always had. He kept walking, checked the rest of his route, filed his report. The report did not mention the woman on the steps. Some things belonged in reports, and some things belonged in the category of human situations that the report format was not designed to contain. He thought about Webb's word, honoring, the kind that let you put something down without losing it. The bench by the fountain at Veterans Park was refurbished in December. The city's parks department had been working its way through a scheduled maintenance program, replacing worn fixtures throughout the park system. The fountain bench was the last to be done. New planks, new paint, the same configuration, just sturdier. A small brass plaque was affixed to the back of the bench, as all the refurbished benches in veterans' parks received, with the general dedication to veterans of all conflicts. Carver saw it on his Saturday morning drive past. The new wood, pale against the older concrete of the fountain's surround. The brass plaque catching the winter light. Webb was on the bench when Carver drove past. He had not been there the previous 2 Saturdays, the daughter's visit presumably, and then whatever recalibration of routine followed a visit. But he was there now, in the canvas jacket and the worn boots, with his paper bag, sitting in the December morning with the specific attentive quality that Carver had come to recognize as simply how this man existed in a space. The bench was new. The man was the same. Carver slowed the patrol car, did not stop, drove past at the speed of someone who had checked a thing and found it in order. Webb did not look up. He was looking at the fountain, which was off for the winter, its basin empty and waiting for spring. Carver drove on. He thought about the bench, about the continuity of a place even when its material was replaced, about whether the bench Webb was sitting on was the same bench his father had brought him to on Saturday mornings, or a different bench in the same position, or some combination of the two that the question of sameness could not quite reach. He thought about his father's kitchen table, the one that was still in the house on Birch Street, where his mother still lived. The table where they had sat on Sunday mornings. The table was the same table, same wood, same chairs, same corner of the same kitchen. But the person who had sat across from him was gone. and the morning conversations were gone, and what remained was the table and the memory and the specific quality of knowing that a place had been the location of something important even after the important thing had moved into the category of memory rather than present reality. The bench was new, but the bench was the bench. That was enough. He drove the rest of his rotation, checked his corners, logged his observations, did the ordinary work of someone who had been assigned a specific geography and was responsible for it. He was 24 years old. He was going to be doing this for a long time. He was going to become, eventually, the kind of officer who had seen enough to be useful to the officers who came after him. He was going to have things to say about situations that surprised people, because situations don't surprise people in the same way once you've learned enough to recognize their shapes. He was not there yet, but he had started. And starting, he had learned from a man on a bench in a park, was where everything began. The starting was not nothing. The starting was, in fact, the point. Everything that came after. The 41 years, the situations, the work, the reputation that arrived with sufficient speed to incapacitate 4 young men before they understood what was happening. All of that had begun with a father and a 7-year-old boy and a bench by a fountain on Saturday mornings. The things you do become part of you, not part of the place. Carver drove home. He would be back at work on Monday. He would be paying attention. January came to Kellerman cold and clear, the kind of January that made the streets look like they'd been cleaned by the weather, everything sharp-edged and direct in the low winter light. Carver had a new partner for the rotation. Standard department practice. Partners rotated every 6 months, partly for cross-training and partly because long-term partnerships in small departments had a tendency to develop into silos, 2 people who handled their territory well but stopped learning from their colleagues. The new partner was Officer Dana Fitch, 31 years old, 7 years on the force, transferred from the East Side rotation, where she had developed the specific competence of someone who had learned a particular geography thoroughly and was now being required to learn a different one. She was, Carver quickly understood, good. Faster than him in some ways. She processed situations at a speed that came from 7 years, rather than 4, from having seen more of the shapes that situations took. Different in others, she had less of the specific quality of attentiveness he'd been developing, the habit of letting what he was looking at tell him what it was, rather than telling it what it was. This was not a criticism. It was just a difference, the kind that came from different training and different experiences, and would resolve over time into something complementary. On their 3rd rotation together, they drove through Veterans Park on a Saturday morning. Fitch looked at the bench by the fountain, at the old man in the canvas jacket with the paper bag. She said, "That guy's been here every time we've come through. Know anything about him?" Carver said, "Yes." She waited. He didn't elaborate. She said, "And?" He said, "He's a retired federal officer. 41 years. The captain knows him personally. He comes to this bench on Saturdays because his father brought him here when he was 7. Fitch looked at the bench again, at the old man, who had not acknowledged the patrol car. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "I responded to a call 3 months ago. He was involved." She said, "What kind of call?" He described it, briefly. The 4 men, the park, the 40 seconds, the empty bench and the occupied bench, the captain arriving in 11 minutes in her personal vehicle. Fitch listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "And you just let him sit there?" He said, "Yes." She said, "How did you know that was the right call?" He thought about it, about the 11-minute arrival and the name the captain had said, and the conversation on the bench he hadn't been close enough to hear, and the procedure the captain had given him afterward that was accurate in every particular that mattered. He said, "I followed the captain's instructions. She told me to wait with him and not process him. I did that." Fitch said, "But before that, when you found him on the 2nd bench, you could have processed him then, before she arrived." He said, "I could have." but something about the situation told me it wasn't resolved yet. That there was information I didn't have yet that the situation required. She said, "What told you that?" He said, "The way he was sitting, not what he was doing, what he wasn't doing. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't moving. He was sitting exactly the way someone sits when they're waiting for the next thing to happen, rather than trying to prevent it." Fitch looked at the bench as they drove past. She said, "You noticed that from across the park in the dark with a flashlight." He said, "I'd already seen him once, by the fountain. I'd had a few minutes to register what he looked like." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I would have processed him. Fast and clean, no complications. Run the name, ID the individual, close the call." He said, "That would have been correct procedure." She said, "But it would have been wrong." He said, "It would have been incomplete, not wrong. The procedure would have produced the right result eventually. The federal flag would have come up. The captain would have been notified. It just would have taken a different path." She said, "Yours was faster." He said, "Mine was what the situation suggested. I was paying attention to what the situation was telling me, rather than to what my training had prepared me to look for. That's not always right. Most of the time, the training is sufficient. But sometimes—" He stopped. She said, "Sometimes what?" He said, "Sometimes the situation is carrying more than the training covers." She was quiet for the rest of the rotation. Carver drove. They checked their corners, did their work. At the end of the shift, in the parking lot, she said, "I want to meet him." The old man. He said, "I'll ask." He asked. Webb said yes, with the specific lack of drama he brought to most things. They met at the same diner. Webb was already in the booth when they arrived. He looked at Fitch. She looked at him. The standard assessment of two people with professional backgrounds reading each other. He said, 7 years, East Side rotation. She said, "Yes." He said, "You want to know about the park." She said, "I want to know how you knew that sitting back down was the right choice." Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "It was the only choice that made sense. I had done what needed to be done. The situation was resolved. Leaving would have been unnecessary movement. I dislike unnecessary movement." She said, "You weren't worried about the police response?" He said, "I expected the police response. I factored it in." She said, "What did you expect to happen?" He said, "I expected a young officer to arrive and find a complicated situation he didn't have the background to fully assess. I expected him to follow procedure, which he did. I expected the procedure to create a contact with the captain, which it did. I expected the captain to come, which she did." Fitch looked at Carver, then back at Webb. She said, "You planned for that?" He said, "I don't plan situations. I consider contingencies. There's a difference." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "A plan assumes a specific outcome and works toward it. A contingency assumes uncertainty and prepares for multiple outcomes. I considered the contingency in which a police officer arrived and found me on a bench, assessed the situation with the information available to him, and acted accordingly. Officer Carver acted correctly for his information level. That was the best possible outcome of that contingency." She looked at Carver again, something in her expression that was recalibrating. She said, "He was testing you." Carver said, "I don't think he was testing me. I think he was sitting on a bench with his paper bag and 4 drunk men made a choice, and he responded, and then he sat back down and the situation went where it went." Webb said nothing. Fitch said, "But you factored in all the contingencies." Webb said, "I factor in contingencies. That's different from creating situations to test outcomes." The distinction was real, and both of them understood it. But Carver had the sense that the distinction was also partial, that the specific result of the contingency, the young officer who followed procedure and went back to check the park and didn't close the call, had been noted and filed in the way that Webb filed things, in the category of information about people that was worth having. He didn't say this. He ate his soup. Webb drank his coffee. Fitch asked 3 more questions, all of them good ones, and received 3 answers that were complete within specific limits. They walked out of the diner into the cold January street. Webb said goodbye to both of them with equal brevity and walked in the direction of the park. It was a Tuesday, not a Saturday, but Carver had the sense that the bench distinctions were more flexible than they had initially appeared. Fitch walked beside him to the car. She said, "I understand now why the captain gave him your number." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you know how to be with someone like that without making it strange. Most people would have been nervous. You were just present." He said, "I was following instructions. She told me to wait with him and not process him. I did that." She said, "That's not all you did." He thought about that, about sitting in the park with an old man who had done 41 years of things Carver would never fully know and who had asked for his contact information afterward, about the diner meeting and the things that had been said and the things that had not been said, about being present in the specific sense of being exactly where you are, which was simpler to describe than to do. He said, "I paid attention." She said, "Yes, that's what I mean." They drove back to the precinct, filed their end-of-shift reports, said goodnight. Carver drove home through the January streets of Kellerman, past the park where the bench by the fountain waited under the winter sky. He didn't stop, didn't need to. He had checked it on the rotation, and it was in order and would be in order on Saturday when he drove past again. He thought about his father's kitchen table, about Webb's father's bench, about the places that hold things for us until we come back to them, about how coming back was not always possible, and how the impossibility of it was one of the things you had to make your peace with, in whatever way peace was available, using whatever means you had. He was 24 years old. He had been doing this for 4 years, and was going to do it for a long time more. He was going to learn things from that long time that he could not learn any other way. He was going to become, eventually, someone who could sit across a table from a young officer and say things that were worth hearing. He wasn't there yet, but he was paying attention, and that, as best he could tell, was where it started.